A buddy recently suggested that I take a little time to go through all the tools that I'm regularly using on these videos to make cocktails. At first, I didn't really know what he meant because I have a cup and a spoon and a Y peeler and a juicer and a specialized ice cube tray and an atomizer, and I quickly realized he was probably right. So I'm going to go through most of the tools I use on a regular basis to make cocktails in order from 10 to 1. So 10 being probably least essential but still fun to have, and 1 being on the more essential side that I use every time I make a drink. So without further ado, let's get into the list. So first up in the 10 slot, we've got an atomizer. An atomizer probably isn't necessary unless you, like me, really enjoy a sazerac. And so I keep absinthe in mine and use it to spritz the inside of the glass to make a sazerac. But some folks actually will put dry vermouth in theirs and use it for an extremely dry martini and just spritz the inside of the glass with the vermouth instead of putting it in their mixing glass. That's a perfectly valid use for it too. One of my favorite things is that they often come in 2 or 3 packs. And so if you need to buy one, you can probably get one for a buddy and make it a friendship atomizer pack. In the 9 slot, I'm putting a double strainer. A double strainer is one that I often honestly forget to use in videos and usually forget to use at home too, but it does kind of elevate the experience a little bit. It pulls out ice chips. If you're making a shake and drink, often you fracture a lot of that ice and can make little ice chips, which in some drinks can enhance the experience if you like that little bit of a chewy kind of snow cone vibe in a shake and drink. But if you really want the texture to be smooth in a shake and drink whenever you take a sip, this can help pull out some of the ice chips as well as some fine herbs if you're using like mint or basil in a cocktail. Also, this one kind of trips people up, but if you have a drink that should have foam on the top, a strainer won't strain out the foam. It'll actually help help the layer to look a little bit more uniform across the surface of the drink. So I'm going to shake up a drink real quick. It's actually just ice and water with a little bit of dried basil, but that way I can show you what the fine strainer actually pulls out. So I've mixed up just a little bit of ice and water and actually some dried basil just to illustrate what this will do. So not a real drink. I won't leave a recipe in the comments, but illustration purposes only. So yeah, we've got that ice broken down. We've got our drink chilled. I'll still use a strainer like this, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and then the double strainer. And so looks like what you can see here is the ice chips down in the bottom, as well as the herbs, which we've strained out. Next up, we have a mixing glass. Now, I've used this in several videos. I've also said that you can use a pint glass and a chopstick and stir things up, and that works fine. The reason I like this one specifically, or just having a dedicated mixing glass, is for capacity. And so if you're using a pint glass, you can totally mix up 1 drink. I can mix 2 or sometimes even 3 drinks, depending on how much liquid is in the mix. And so I like having this one just because it gives me that extra capacity. And if you're entertaining a group of people, it can be nice to make 3 of the same drink and have it all done at the same time and then get back to the conversation or the game or whatever you were doing before. Next, we have a Barspoon. This is one, I like the length of it quite a bit. This is probably a bit longer than I need, but it's one that I like. And it is sort of dual function. So this measure I've found is right about 1/6 of an ounce. I've seen people say anywhere from 1/4 ounce to 1/8 of an ounce. I've found that 1/6 of an ounce is pretty accurate, or 5 milliliters if you prefer that system. And so I can use it to measure out simple syrup and then stir it directly in the mixing glass. And then because it has this long handle, let me get some ice. It lets you keep a sufficient distance away from the glass to really get that circular movement going. I found that one of the trickiest things in learning how to spin a cocktail like this is that if your handle is too short or too wide, it can be hard to let the spoon spin in your hand. And one of the things that I'm not doing whenever I'm stirring a cocktail, and I'll show this just for illustration's sake, is, well, now it's kind of stuck, is this movement. And that, while chaotic, is to illustrate that when I'm stirring, It's smooth because the back of the spoon is what's touching the entire time I'm spinning. And so that movement actually requires the spoon to spin in my hand while I'm stirring the drink. So I'm not holding it like this, but I tend to put my ring finger behind it and my middle and index finger in front of it with pinky kind of floating like so. And I can spin the handle in my hand to get a nice smooth action. Um, One of the things you'll hear some folks say is that if you stir too aggressively, you can bruise the spirit. I don't know that I totally believe that, but if you do break the ice, you'll cause more chips and splinters, and it does impact the smoothness of the texture of a stirred drink. Next up, we'll talk about my True Cubes ice tray. True Cubes is the name brand of this item. It's a three-piece system which allows directional freezing. There's a lot of different ways to make ice like this. There's one method that I've seen described as a sort of budget approach in that you can just buy, move this over, you can just buy a small igloo cooler, and it does, directional freezing just means that your block or your amount of water, once you put it in the freezer, if it freezes all from one direction, this part stays open on the top once you have all the pieces together. That means it's going to freeze from the top down, pushing the little tiny micro bubbles from the surface of the water down as it freezes slowly, because the solidification process of the ice is kind of squeezing those bubbles or squeezing that gas out of the ice. And so directional freezing allows, let me take a step back. The reason why those tiny little moon-shaped ice cubes have haziness in the center is because they freeze from the outside in. And so those air bubbles don't have anywhere to go, and they get trapped in the center where they make hazy ice. I don't personally have a problem with that kind of hazy ice in certain applications, but if I'm making an old fashioned, I really do want a big clear cube. And so while there are other options, I mentioned there are more kind of like budget ways to do this. If you have a small igloo cooler, one that fits inside your freezer, like a little rectangular one, I don't think it ends up actually saving you that much money, because then you have to buy some ice tools to be able to chip and shave that ice into a smaller usable piece. So I've found that this solution works great for me. It's about 40, 45 bucks from Amazon. This is the outer portion. The water doesn't actually touch this. And so this is the bottom chamber. You can see there's 4 sections down there. So I put that in like so. And then this is the top chamber. This is where your usable ice will actually be. And so push that in, fill it up with water all the way to the top. Once you fill from the top, it fills the bottom chambers too. And then what it leaves on the top is 4 ice cubes at a time. It takes about 18, 20 hours in the freezer overnight. And then you're left with an ice cube like this. You can see there, it's totally clear. And so it works great for just a pour of whiskey on a big rock. It's kind of nice. But yeah, part of the reason why you'd want to use a cube like this is functional. It melts slower, and so it dilutes and lets you enjoy your drink over a longer period of time. But also it's just a more enjoyable experience to look at, and it kind of refracts light in a fun way. So as I say frequently, because drinks are for fun, this is a way that can kind of make the drink more visually appealing and a little bit more fun. Next up, we've got a juicer. It doesn't really matter what kind of juicer you're using. The important thing is that you are squeezing fresh citrus within 20, 24 hours or so of when you're actually going to be making the drink. You can make a drink with bottled citrus. I think this is a pretty inexpensive way to elevate your drinks though, because when you're squeezing citrus, I don't know if you'll be able to see it here on the camera, but when you're squeezing citrus, there are a lot of oils that are released from the peel into the juice. So this is my juicing rig I have here. I'm really just talking about this part, but also the strainer helps to keep some of the pulp. And because I have a wide glass container with a spout on it, I can keep the pulp out of the juice, and then I'll transfer this to something like a Topo Chico bottle like you've seen me use before. You might even be able to see some of the oils kind of released into the air, which is kind of fun. But in addition to those just being pretty, you also get aroma that's connected to those. And if you do this too early in advance, or if you use this use juice from a bottled container, you're not going to get any of that great fresh aroma that really makes the juice add a flavor that's beyond just the sourness that's present in citrus juice. So yeah, fresh squeezing lime, really just gives a beautiful aroma to your house, but importantly, your drink. And so I'm in a big rum phase right now. Daiquiris and Mai Tais are right at the top of my list. So the smell of fresh squeezed citrus is an exciting aroma in this house. Next up is a Y peeler. If you have a potato peeler at home, you can likely use it. I like this one in particular for a couple reasons. One of the things is the direction of the blade as compared to the handle. It lets me really get good control over where the blade is moving so that I can get a nice wide piece of citrus and a pretty long piece of citrus. I find oftentimes whenever I'm using a potato peeler or trying to make a drink in an Airbnb or something like that, I end up with these sort of narrow and oblong, diagonal, accidental pieces. And that is better than nothing. You can totally use that to put a little fresh citrus oil over the surface of a drink. But this one gives me more control and I just enjoy using it. There's also little kind of serrated teeth on the edge. I'm sure lots of peelers have that, but this is one that works really well. And I'll show you over the surface of my fancy basil water from earlier that you can pull a swath pretty wide like that and put some citrus oil over the surface. So let's try my little lemon basil water. Wow. Kind of funny whenever you're putting it into something that doesn't have alcohol because the lemon aroma isn't really competing with anything else, so it's pretty overpowering. Next up is my strainer. This style of strainer is called a Hawthorne strainer. The other common one for cocktails is called a julep strainer. And so most, I think probably bar professionals would prefer to use a Hawthorne strainer for a shaker, and they would use a julep strainer, which I don't have here, for a mixing glass. And so as you'll notice, this fits over the mixing glass just fine, and I'm all in favor of using fewer tools to do more things. So this is one that I use for everything. Maybe one day I'll get a julep strainer if I find a really pretty one or one that has some kind of significance, but for now this works great. One thing I did want to point out is that you can use this little button kind of to push forward, and they call that open gate, closed gate. It does allow you to restrict the flow of the liquid coming out of the glass. I don't use it that frequently, to be honest. It is kind of a nice feature, but if I really do want to get a finer strain, I'll just use that fine mesh strainer like I mentioned before. But that's kind of nice because you can do it with one hand as you're pouring it out of the glass. Next, we have a tin on tin shaker or a Boston shaker. Another common style is called a cobbler shaker. Those are the ones that have the kind of dome lid and then another cap on the top where you shake it with the dome and the cap on it, and then you would pull the little cap but leave the dome on because the dome becomes your strainer as well. There's nothing wrong with those. I had one for a while that I think we got from a wedding registry or maybe somebody just gave us. I like this style for capacity, kind of like the mixing glass, but also for distance. The distance that the ice can travel whenever you're shaking a drink like this impacts the amount of air that you're going to be able to put into the drink. And whenever you're shaking a drink rather than mixing one of the main things, in addition to chilling and diluting, is getting air into the cocktail and impacting the texture, getting those air bubbles for a margarita or a whiskey sour or a daiquiri or something like that. And so by shaking with more distance, you're able to get more aeration in the cocktail. Also, these seal together really well, which is what some people don't like about them because they're kind of hard to separate. You've seen me sometimes kind of knocking several times against my palm to get the two to open, but it is going to ensure that whenever you go to shake a drink with your buddies around, that you don't end up with most of it on your shirt or shoulder or floor or counter or whatever. One thing I will say too, just as a note, this isn't really a techniques episode, but when you're shaking a drink, I always say, and this is not my quote, but I got it from somewhere, some book, is that you shake a drink to wake it up, not to rock it to sleep. So I have seen some bartenders pour up their drink, put in the ice, and kind of give it one of these, turn it over, or give it one of these where you're shaking this way, or just kind of giving it a quick back and forth and then dump it into a cup. That will slightly chill and slightly dilute and maybe even slightly aerate a drink, but it's really not the point. And we want to drink better here. And so I am really fond of these shakers, shaking really hard and then straining into whatever glass you're going to use. Finally, we have a jigger. This is the 10th or the first, depending on which way you're counting, of what I think is the most important thing that I have in my home bar. You can see here there's actually 3 measurements on each side. This side is 1/4 ounce, 1/2 ounce, and full ounce. And then this other side is 1/3 ounce, 3/4 of an ounce, and 1.5 ounces. And so that allows me to really do a lot of different drinks and a lot of different subdivisions. Sometimes if you find a recipe that calls for 1/2 ounce of simple syrup and you just want to scale it down a little bit, you don't want half as much as in a 1/4 ounce. I don't know if you're good with fractions or not. I understand they can be tricky for some, but a 1/3 ounce is a really nice option to be able to scale things down. And then, like I mentioned, the Barspoon earlier, you can even cut that in half further and just use a 1/6 ounce. There's also a 1/4 ounce in between there. I think you get my point. I like this jigger a lot because there are 6 different options, and with the Barspoon, I have a 7th. And that really lets me do everything that I want to do for a drink. A bonus item, something that didn't quite make the list, is a pour spout. Pour spout isn't totally necessary. I've used it sometimes whenever I've done kind of small little home events and I want to be able to pour quicker or more cleanly. I also do like using it on my little home bottles for citrus juice. It allows just a little bit more control. I normally say that's all for drinks today, but we just made some different fancy waters. So that's all for tools today. I put links for everything down in the show notes. You may have most of this stuff already, and maybe you just got a tip about how to use them a little better. But if you want to fill up that kitchen drawer with a couple more cocktail-specific tools, feel free to use those links. Did I miss anything? Do you have a favorite tool I left out or one that you want to share? Feel free to send me a note or a comment if there's something that you want to see more about. Next week, we'll be back with a old-fashioned and some tips and tricks for how to make that super tasty. There's some things I don't like about old fashions that I've been served in the past, and some tips that I think are super important. So we'll get into those soon. And between now and then, just remember, drinks are for fun. And my goal with this channel is to teach people enough to be able to share that fun with the people they love. Come and be amazed at what you can do. Cheers.